The dark lord who laughs maniacally and is evil just to be evil is a cliche. But the dark lord who has a traumatic backstory and might even be a wee bit sympathetic is a trope. So it's the same character on the page, it's just a little different current of craft running underneath it. So fantasy readers will burn out on the cliched version of the chosen one. They'll burn out on the cliched knight in shining armor or the cliched damsel in distress, but they will not burn out on a smarter version of all of those things. Hi, it's Abby from Dabble. And today we're talking about how to subvert old tropes, what modern fantasy is actively leaving behind, and how to make the conventions of your genre feel brand new. All right, let's do a little recap of our trilogy of trope videos so far. Part 1 was about the people, the chosen one, the orphan, your dark lord, etc. Part 2 was about the tropes in your world, so the prophecies, forbidden magic, vast geography, and the like. So both are linked below. But today's video is the part most aspiring writers actually worry about, and it's tropes versus cliches. So how do you use the conventions of your genre without sounding tired? We'll spend a couple of minutes on the tropes the genre is actively retiring because agents and readers are just over them. All right, so first, let's talk about a trope versus a cliche. So here are the definitions kind of side by side. A trope is a commonly recurring storytelling device, and we covered a bunch of them in parts 1 and 2. But a cliche is what happens when that trope gets executed the same way so many times that it has lost any emotional impact. They use the same idea. Like I said, there's just a different layer of craft running underneath it. So the Dark Lord is a trope, but the cackling, like evil, just to be evil Dark Lord with zero backstory is a cliche. It's been done a million times. There's still a place for it, but you should consider if your story will deepen if you challenge that cliche. So the cliche lets the reader guess every move, but tropes can keep surprising the reader even when they recognize the shape. So here's a test you can run on any element in your draft. Can you reimagine it without losing what makes it resonate? If yes, you've got a trope. If no, you may have a cliche. All right, let's talk about subverting tropes. When you subvert a trope, you take a familiar device and surprise the audience by changing the formula. It's usually by going somewhere they weren't expecting it to go. So a great example from our W article is River Solomon's novel, The Deep. Yatu is the chosen one of her people. She's the only one bestowed with the memories of their traumatic history, and her ability to hold that trauma on behalf of the community keeps them safe. So it's a classic chosen one scenario, right? Until the burden of her role begins to destroy her. The book uses the trope's recognizable shape to challenge the romanticized notion that a predestined heroine's sacrifice will lead her to some glorious victory. Now, that's what good subversion looks like. The reader thinks they know where the trope is going, and then the writer pulls the rug out. And the rug pull sort of illuminates something true about the original trope rather than just contradicting it for a twist. Now, bad subversion is contrarianism for its own sake. Like, what if the chosen one was actually bad? Or what if the prophecy was a lie? Or what if the mentor was secretly evil? So these can be great moves, but they can also be empty if they aren't executed well. So the question to ask yourself is whether your subversion is saying something or if it's just trying to trick the reader. All right, let's talk about what modern fantasy is leaving behind. So subversion is one way that old tropes get a refresh. And the other way is the genre just flat retires them. Fantasy has a list of moves that used to be standard, and now they just read as dated. So it's worth knowing so that you're not accidentally writing one your editor flags in revision. So here are a few big ones. Fetishized women of color, the white savior, a fantasy race that's all inherently evil or all shares one personality, the damsel in distress who has zero agency, a fantasy race with features drawn from racist depictions of a real human culture. So Abby's point in the W article is that these stuck around as long as they did because they weren't really doing visible harm to the writer who was using them. Nobody on that end was clocking them. But now readers are, agents are. And if you're writing middle grade or chapter books like me, this one matters double in our space because kids are forming their worldview from what we hand them. And to be honest, I had one of these in my manuscript and I just didn't catch it. I didn't know I was using it till my editor flagged it. And she was right. And I fixed it and life went on. So if you're drafting fantasy right now, a 30-second search for harmful fantasy tropes before you turn a manuscript in can save you a much bigger revision later. Okay, let's talk about morally gray areas. This is another big shift in modern fantasy. Heroes and villains aren't who they used to be. Heroes and heroines aren't always noble. Anti-heroes are having a moment. Villain protagonists are also having a moment. Readers want moral complexity. And the Dark Lord trope has gotten a makeover. A lot of these villains now have traumatic backstories that explain the cruelty, the greed, the love of dark magic. Their actions aren't justified, but readers recognize them as the actions of a broken person rather than that just cackling evil for evil's sake that we mentioned earlier. So the mentor, and I mentioned this in part one as well, might have ulterior motives. Like the chosen one might have every right to reject their destiny. The knight in shining armor might turn out to be a foul-mouthed ogre with zero interest in being the hero. All of which sort of feeds back into the good versus evil trope. Does it matter if a hero's actions match what's in their heart? Do we call selfish people good if they ultimately do good things? Are actions still evil if you kind of understand where they're coming from? So for low and portal fantasy, specifically this morally gray area often works better in our subgenre than in epic high fantasy. So the closer the story is to the real world, the more believable that nuance feels. I feel like we live morally gray every day. So Stranger Things doing morally complicated Dr. Brenner works because the show is grounded. The same character in a high fantasy kingdom might just read as a confused villain. All right, here's a cliche avoidance test. This is the practical part. How do you keep yourself from sliding into cliches while you draft? So there's 3 questions to ask of any trope in your manuscript. And these are basically lifted right out of Abby's W article that I've been referring to this whole time. And they're really, really useful. So 1, what's this trope's role in your conflict? Not like, what is the mentor archetype in general, but like, what's my mentor doing in my story to drive the conflict? Okay, 2, how does this trope reflect your theme? If your book is about the cost of secrecy, your veiled magic trope should be doing thematic work, not just window dressing. And 3, where does it fall short? In what ways is your version of this trope weaker or thinner than the genre standard? Naming the limitation is what unlocks the revision. So run those 3 questions on every trope that you're using, and you've already done more craft work than most drafts that I've seen. All right, the 3 big rules. There are 3 rules from the article for using these tropes well, and these are going to close out the series. So rule 1, know your audience. hang out in fantasy forums, go to book events, talk tropes with friends and followers. You'll start to notice what fantasy readers love and hate right now. Now, you're not going to make everyone happy, but if you notice a lot of readers are sort of over vampire romance, maybe pick a different species for your love interest. So rule number 2, blend and twist. Get creative. Combine tropes that don't normally go together. The article has my favorite quick example. What if the damsel in distress was, in fact, a dark lady? Maybe that's a fresh take. So rule number 3, and this is most important, put the story first. As much as your readers love their favorite tropes, they're ultimately here for a good story. So don't force a trope that doesn't fit. Don't get so wrapped up in crafting the ultimate magical artifact that it overshadows the conflict and the character growth. Trope service should never come at the expense of story service. All right, so that's the trilogy. 5 character tropes, 6 world tropes, 3 rules for using them all, and all without slipping into cliché. So remember, tropes are how readers find you. Smart use of tropes is how you keep those readers turning pages. Thanks for hanging out with us across all 3 videos. We'll see you in the next video.